We are back on Taking Care of Business on Kern Radio Newstalk 1180. Our guest by phone is Sally Pipes, the president of the Pacific Research Institute. Sally, before we pick up where we left off, I have a question before we get too far away from this. I was looking on your website, the Pacific Research Institute website, which I love. It's a dynamite website. It has all the publications that you guys have come up with and articles. And you had something called the California Sick Tax Clock.
Right.
Can you and it looked like the national debt clock, the way that thing was just ticking away. I think this morning, or no, last night when I was looking at it, it was $331 million. What is the California Sick Tax Clock?
That is something that John Graham, who is our Director of Healthcare Studies, the idea that he thought up, and it's really, looking at, what the cost of healthcare is going to be, what's going to happen under Obamacare with, the expansion of Medi-Cal. And this state, of course, is, $20 billion in debt. And how can we, tax the people of California more in order to cover, putting more people on Medi-Cal and covering their health care.
Mm-hmm. Well, before the break, you were talking about companies and their reaction. Starbucks this week, Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, who's, fairly, he's pretty liberal, and he's been a big Obama supporter. He came out and said that the bill is going to land in 2014 on small business, and the mandate's too great. There's no way small business can handle it. And IHOP turned around and said that their profit per employee is $3,000, and the legislation is going to cost them anywhere from $7,000 to $10,000. So they're going to be losing money on every employee.
Right. I mean, isn't it interesting that someone like Howard Schultz from Seattle, I'm originally from Vancouver in British Columbia. I started going to Starbucks probably in the mid '80s in Seattle before it became what it is today. It started out as a small business and grew into a big business. That is the entrepreneurial spirit in America. That's where jobs are created. Small business creates jobs, not big business. 85% of new jobs in this country are created by small business. So Howard Schultz, being from Seattle, being a Democrat who's originally from Brooklyn, New York, big supporter of Obama's, big supporter of Obamacare. Well, now he realizes what the cost of this legislation means to him and to his company. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of these companies that seem to be rallying around the flag supporting the legislation now are realizing what it's going to mean to their bottom line. If you can't make a profit, you can't stay in business and you can't expand. Only government can stay in business by running a deficit and building up the national debt.
Sally, one of the other problems that people aren't aware of is all the different penalties that are going to be hitting them individually or as an employer on a group basis if they don't meet certain rules and regulations. Can you touch on some of those rules and regulations and penalties?
Right. So part of the legislation, of course, is the individual mandate. And as I said earlier, if the individual mandate is ruled unconstitutional, Obamacare is going to fall apart. Because what would happen is, under this legislation, people would buy insurance when they're sick and they would drop it, when they're well, and insurance companies cannot stay in business. This is what has happened in Massachusetts under Romney Care. And so, I think they realized this. And actually, on this September 23rd, controls on insurance companies that came in, one was that insurance companies would have to write child-only policies for children with pre-existing conditions. Well, the interesting thing is that what has happened is insurance companies in 20 states in the nation have said they can't, they've pulled out of the market. They're not writing child-only policies because it's a losing, proposition for them. So that's important. But we have, under the individual mandate, if in 2014, when the individual mandate will come into being, if it's not ruled unconstitutional, if you cannot show on your tax return that you have health insurance, you will pay a fine of $695 or 2.5% of income, whichever is greater. And so, we even know that in Massachusetts, a lot of the fine there, the penalty is $1,150, I think it is. And a lot of young people say, I'd rather pay that fine than spend $4,000 to $5,000 a year on health insurance. So we have that. We also, under the legislation, they're going to have to hire 16,000 new IRS agents in order to monitor whether people like you and myself have insurance and show it on our tax return. There are things like the 1099 reporting requirement where anyone who does a business-to-business transaction of $600 a year or more will have to file a 1099. This part of the bill, the act, has already been repealed in both the House and the Senate.
Good.
But it'll be interesting to see if the president will sign it, because it's going to wipe out $17 billion in revenue that he was counting on.
Now, is that on his desk to sign right now, Sally?
I don't know if it's at his desk, but it's certainly ready. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about, well, where are they going to make up that revenue? But he is on record saying that he supports repeal of the 1099. The question is, what kind of repeal does he actually support? And, what would he bring in to say, how is he going to raise that $17 billion? Because, as you know, the Congressional Budget Office said this legislation is going to cost $940 billion over 10 years from 2010 to 2019. But most of the cost drivers under Obamacare don't come into effect until 2014. So if you take the decade 2014 to 2024, the cost of this legislation is about $2.5 trillion over that 10-year period.
Incredible.
And the other point we know is that Medicare and Medicaid came into being in 1965, and Lyndon Johnson was the president. Medicare cost $3 billion in the first year, and they predicted it would cost $12 billion in 1990. Well, in fact, it cost $110 billion. So when people think something's free, they demand a lot more of it. And I think Obamacare, if it's not repealed, will even cost more than that $2.5 trillion.
Yeah, no question about it. Our guest by phone is Sally Pipes, president of the Pacific Research Institute.
Sally, I want to do a selfish plug here, but if people have questions, they're welcome to call my office at 427-4700. That's 427-4700, and ask for Clay. There are some pretty good points in the bill, such as covering dependents to age 26. Originally, I thought that was a pretty good point. However, when does a dependent become responsible for themselves? And then being able to cover a dependent who lives in another state, is married, that doesn't seem reasonable. They also talked about no waiting periods for pre-existing conditions for children under 19, and 100% for preventative services, no annual maximum on benefits. So there were some pretty good points, but they all drive the cost up.
Well, you're absolutely right. We know, even the Congressional Budget Office said, when the president said with these controls on insurance companies that came into being last September 23rd, that the free preventive care for mammograms, PSA tests, colonoscopies, this is all going to drive the cost up, because a lot of people are going to be saying, well, I need a colonoscopy, whether or not they need it, whether or not there's a history. There will be a lot of pressure on doctors to do this, and it also, will crowd doctors' offices with a lot of testing. That will drive up the cost. The whole idea of children, young adults, being able to stay on their parents' health care plans till age 26. We've already seen the impact. Premiums in the both the large group and small group market are up around 13%, because if you add children at age, if you say they can be 24, living in a different state, married, I left home at 21. I wouldn't have expected my parents, if I'd lived in the U.S., because in Canada everyone's covered under the government plan, but I wouldn't have expected my parents to add me to their insurance plan. This is a tremendous cost driver. As I mentioned earlier, the pre-existing condition for children, 20 states are no longer writing child-only policies. By 2014, of course, no insurer is going to be able to discriminate based on a pre-existing condition. All of these things are driving the cost up, and the president realizes now that the cost of his legislation is driving up costs, and as I said, will also not lead to universal coverage.
One of the things, we're going to go on a break in a second, but one of the things I want to talk about when we come back are grandfather plans, rules, regulations, and why companies will not be able to qualify to continue their current health insurance benefits. Marty?
Yeah, and also when we come back, I want to talk a little bit, Sally, about Pacific Research Institute. Just tell our listeners a little more about what you guys do and that great website you guys have. So
well, thank you. Love to.
Yeah, it's a great program that you have there. We'll be back in a minute on Kern Radio Newstalk 1180.